Welcome to Rhode Wellness, where we explore all things health and self-care. Whether you're seeking mental clarity, physical fitness, or insight from students like you, we've got you covered. All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to the Rhode Wellness podcast. I'm Olivia Rathbun.
And I'm Arielle Sherman, and I work in health services. I'm a therapist down there, and I support students who may have gone through certain situations with substances.
Great. Thank you. Okay. So this podcast that we're going to be doing is about drug use and drug safety. Of course, we don't condone drug use, but because we are a harm reduction campus and we know that students are going to be using drugs, we want to make sure people are doing it as safely as possible. So we're going to share some information about that today and some harm reduction methods. So jumping into the first question, can you tell us a little bit about THC, what it means, what the content means, and some different methods, I guess talking specifically about marijuana and weed?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about marijuana, weed, cannabis, THC is that primary psychoactive compound within the substance. So THC stands for tetrahydrocannabinol, right? We don't need to remember that. It's really just THC. So recognizing that THC is the thing that makes you high. The THC content in weed products are usually listed, if we're purchasing from a dispensary, they're usually listed in either percentages or milligrams. Let's say for percentages, the THC percentage equates the weight, the total weight of how much THC is in a product. If we're buying like bud or flower, right? So THC is listed as a percentage of total weight of it versus like milligrams, which could be like in edibles, oils, carts, pens, dabs, things like that. That will list the amount of THC in the milligrams per serving or per package. For example, milligrams, if you're buying gummies or whatever it is, then that potential THC could be listed as like 10 milligrams or 5 milligrams per piece. So that would be already kind of like your quote unquote serving size. So that's just like a very brief overall idea of what THC is. But at the end of the day, THC is that stuff that gets you high in the products that we may be using.
Okay, great. And like looking at these different methods, how can a person find their limit? I know you talked about it a little bit, but especially looking at that THC percentage, and if a person's choosing to use different methods, how can a person make sure that they're staying consistent within their limit?
Yeah, that's a good question. The thing that I want to make sure students are aware of is kind of like, if we're using this stuff, to find your THC limit, always, just like alcohol, is like starting out with a low dose, right? So starting out gradually, for example, like smoking or vaping, say your pen or your vape or something has like 5 to 10% THC. Usually when I'm talking to students, it's like, do not do more than like 1 to 2 hits. So it's like, do that, see how you feel after like 20, 30 minutes before deciding you need more. And I think it's really important paying attention to how you feel. So if we feel relaxed, if we feel more clear-headed and not overly anxious, then we're like, okay, maybe this is my limit, 1 to 2 hits from something. You've likely found it. But if we start to feel paranoid, if we start to feel overly anxious and that panicky feeling, or like even dizzy, we probably have overconsumed. And that has probably been pushing our limit. We then lead into these like quote-unquote negative consequences. And so I do think it's important for students to be aware of like what these possibly could be, different reactions, common reactions that occur when we overconsume, when we go past our limit. So people start to feel really anxious. They even start to feel like fearful of certain things, paranoid of certain things in their like surrounding environment. Increased heart rate. So this could be like the panic feeling. This could be like truly your like heartbeat begins to rapidly pound in your chest. A lot of confusion sometimes happens if we're overly high. And sometimes a lot of people call it like, I'm greening out. We feel like we've smoked too much. We feel like we hit the pen too much. We had 1 too many edibles. We also have to think about the difference between edibles, carts, vapes, like a joint, something like that. Onset time, like how quickly we get high, really varies. And thinking about that, we need to hold ourselves to like, okay, I'm going to do this one thing and I'm going to wait a certain amount of time. I'm going to have a friend with me and we're going to hold each other accountable, that kind of stuff. I also think that recognizing and knowing the potency in each different method that we might use, so whether that is a pen or like a dab or an edible. So when we're talking about dab pens, that's like between 80 to like 95% THC. That's a huge amount in comparison to potentially a joint or potentially like an edible that has been purchased from a dispensary that indicates it's 5 milligrams of THC or something. Very different potencies, which then ends up in a very different high. And even sometimes with edibles that happens because people don't feel high enough quick enough. So if we have one edible and then 30 minutes later it doesn't hit us when we want it to hit us, then we take another one, even though edibles have this like grace period of 30 minutes to like 2.5 hours for potential to hit. So if we don't feel it in 30 minutes, sometimes people take another one and then by, an hour later, we're potentially quote unquote greened out or we're just extremely high. Another thing that is rare but possible are these psychotic symptoms. So we get into this idea of hallucinations, delusions, seeing things that aren't there, hearing things that aren't there, believing things that aren't to be true. So higher doses are stronger than we anticipate. And these symptoms occur for a lot of different reasons for a lot of different bodies, but it is something that potentially can happen. And it can be really scary, right? Because they are so believable when somebody may be experiencing them. If any of these things are to happen, that is our cue to call 911. That is our cue to use the medical amnesty policy to protect the community in general, to help this person out, to help our friend out, because we never want things to get so bad that something else occurs because of this stuff. One thing I did want to bring up is this is if we have a habit, if we become routinely smoking every day or taking edibles every day, or it's usually a lot of times people have pens because they're so easy. People can form CHS, which stands for cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, which is actually that recurrent nausea and vomiting and throwing up, abdominal pain for a really long time in heavy users. And it varies. It can be between like a couple months of daily use, or if it is an extreme amount of use, then it could even be like a few weeks, but really being cognizant that this can happen. CHS is this weird thing that occurs when people have been smoking. And so people then feel like it's not actually the weed, but it's because I can't eat if I don't smoke, and then we have all those different things, right? And that's another symptom to bring up is our body could potentially get so used to smoking before eating that we need the weed to then eat or to have an appetite or to feel like we want food. So the last two that I just talked about, the CHS syndrome and then the not really having an appetite, these are for long-term heavy users. The other stuff I discussed, that idea of confusion, increased heart rate, anxiety, paranoia, panic attacks, hallucinations, delusions, this can happen in shorter time usage. And again, recognizing that if you have a friend who's experienced this stuff, if you have experienced this stuff and then you come out of the high and then you remember it and you notice it, this is really this time to either call 911 in the moment or to definitely reach out for support on campus.
And is CHS like an inevitable thing that will happen to long-term users, or does it just like depend on the person?
Depends on the person. It's a very weird thing, and people are still studying it, but it has been more common more recently. And studies have potentially seen that idea of the higher percentage THC products, the dab pens, all of this stuff that has that 70 to 95% THC.
And how can a person prevent these bad reactions from happening? I know you said, like, obviously knowing your limits, sticking with that, but is there any other practical tips that you suggest?
Yeah. So again, same thing that you just said, starting out with a low dose, knowing the THC content in the product that you are using. So then that gets into like the where are we getting this product from? Are we getting it from Joe Schmo who got it from this other human? Or are we 21 and above and we are then purchasing it from a dispensary? Or has it been known to come from a dispensary? That's when we know that we know exactly how much THC content potentially is in that if we are buying it from a distributor. Also, I would always suggest if we are quote unquote trying these things out, if we're curious about things, staying in a comfortable and safe environment, not trying these things in a brand new situation. So if we are going to socialize with new friends, then that would not be the time to experiment with new substances. Avoid mixing other substances as well. Combining weed with alcohol or other drugs, even like caffeine, can increase the chance of these negative side effects that can occur when using, like nausea, dizziness, anxiety, panic, just impaired judgment in general, right?
And that pertains to prescription drugs as well,
Yes.
right? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Always just staying hydrated and eating. I always think that that's just a good thing to do before using any kind of substance, and just taking it slow. Rushing into using a lot of weed too quickly increases these risks of bad reactions. So taking our time and surrounding ourselves with people you trust.
Thank you. And I think moving away from weed now, talking about other substances that people or students can encounter on our campus. I know that some students do use cocaine, do use opioids, and of course not condoning that, but if someone still chooses to use that, what are some harm reduction techniques that these students can use to still stay safe?
Yeah, absolutely. Before getting into the harm reduction techniques, I think it's also important to self-reflect with asking ourselves, why are we seeking out these other substances? Where did we start this? Are we self-medicating? Are we trying to numb something? Are we escaping from something? Are we avoiding addressing something that's present in our life that is really scary or hard, and we don't really know where to start? So I think that it's really important for this, again, like self-reflection period of why are we reaching for these certain substances? Maybe there's an underlying mental health struggle, difficulty that's occurring. It's case by case, but really just like that self-reflection. If we've self-reflected and then we still choose to do what we're going to do, how do we stay as safe as possible? So first off, recognizing on campus, we have a lot of harm reduction methods and techniques for free for students. So there is this great program called CFRP, Community First Response Program. It's run through the pharmacy school, and they provide free harm reduction products to students such as fentanyl test strips and Narcan and a few others, and they are located in Morrill Hall, but if you Google CFRP URI, it'll come up. They do trainings on Narcan as well. So we always stay aware and recognize that fentanyl is a thing, and fentanyl isn't going anywhere. So when we're meeting with reality, we have to recognize that if we're going to be taking cocaine, if we're going to be taking certain pills, then testing before, always carrying Narcan on us, just to potentially serve as a protective factor if something more serious is to occur. These things are not foolproof. Like, they are there to help protect, but they are not there to take away all negative consequences. Other harm reduction methods when we're using different substances is making sure that we're never alone when using these. If something goes wrong, we need to make sure that we have somebody near us to then be the one to call 911, be the one to give Narcan, and then also still call 911 if that's being used. Knowing the signs of overdose is also another form of harm reduction, similar to like over alcohol intoxication, knowing those signs of what to look out for. If we know the signs of overdose, we are more likely to recognize something in a room or recognize something within our friend to then call 911 to get help. Some of those signs can include just like chest pain in general of that person, really fast heart rate, extreme agitation, slowed breathing, pinpoint pupils, unconsciousness. Like, if we notice any of these things, then this is these immediate signs that we're like, okay, 911 is there. I also had mentioned this in a previous episode, is that calling 911 is never the wrong answer. So if we're concerned with even our own reaction, I've had a handful of students call 911 on themselves, right? They smoked too much and they felt really anxious and high, and they didn't know what was going on. So they called 911 on themselves, and they ended up being transported. So that is never the wrong answer. If we're concerned about anything, please call, and know that that is a resource to all students if we are concerned about anything we're seeing or experiencing.
Yeah, and even a mental health emergency is still an emergency.
Exactly.
So you can always call 911 for that.
Yeah,
I think that can be a common misconception that it has to be like a physical
life
safety.
or death. Yeah.
But that's not the case.
Right.
So
yeah,
and I did just have a follow-up question about the Narcan. If you suspect someone has overdosed and, like, say you're on with 911, or like you want to administer Narcan before 911 calls, make sure you call 911 first. But is there any adverse side effects for that? Like, let's say maybe they didn't overdose and it's just alcohol or like another medical issue.
Yeah, that's a great question. So CFRP will do specific trainings and do a really great job getting into all the details of these things. From my knowledge, you can administer Narcan without someone overdosing on fentanyl and they will be okay if you put Narcan in their system. But if they're overdosing on cocaine, it's not going to fix the overdose. What it will what it will reverse in those moments is an overdose from fentanyl. That's why we always say, like, if we're going to administer Narcan, you got to call 911 still, because you're not going to potentially reverse an overdose of the cocaine. But say there's fentanyl in the cocaine and you're administering Narcan, it'll reverse the side effects of fentanyl, but it won't for the cocaine. So we always want to be as safe as possible, so continue to call 911 regardless. And at the end of the day, administering Narcan will not be an unsafe choice.
Yeah, and that training that you mentioned, that is like a free and quick training here at URI, and they give you free Narcan, right? Okay.
Yeah. Every training that you do on campus through CFRP will provide you with a free box of Narcan.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Oh, I did want to mention, too, that fentanyl test strips are available in the wellness vending machine in the 24-hour room. So if you do feel uncomfortable, like, purchasing it from a pharmacy or health services, you can always go in there. It's anonymous.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just around the corner in the 24-hour room.
Yeah, and they also have Narcan. So they have Narcan, fentanyl test strips, and a lot of other just health-related things if you may need it at all hours of the day.
Before we wrap up, a quick reminder that all information shared in today's podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. Thank you for listening to another episode of Rhody Wellness. If you like what you heard today, tune in every Tuesday on all podcast platforms for more. If you want to stay up to date on events and healthcare tips, please follow us at URI Health Promotions on Instagram. And if you have any ideas for future podcast episodes or more social media content that you'd like to see, please feel free to DM us or email us. Until next time, take care and stay healthy.